a dozen eggs for 53 cents, a gallon of milk for 77 cents, a pound of hamburger for 51 cents. If you just read those numbers cold, 1950 sounds like some kind of paradise, doesn't it? Everything practically free. Except it wasn't. And I want to spend today actually digging into why. Because this is one of those questions that sounds simple and turns out to be genuinely complicated the second you look at it closely. Were people in 1950 richer than us? Poorer than us? Or is that even the right question to be asking? Let's actually do the math instead of just guessing, because I think the real answer is more interesting than either the nostalgic version or the everything was terrible version. Let's start with the raw prices, because you need the baseline before any of this makes sense. In 1950, according to Bureau of Labor Statistics records, a gallon of milk cost about 77 cents. A dozen eggs ran around 53 cents.
A pound of ground beef was 51 cents. A pound of coffee cost 79 cents. Bread was somewhere around 14 to 16 cents a loaf. Gasoline was 27 cents a gallon. A median home in America, according to the Census Bureau, was valued at $7,354. Now, here's the number that actually makes all of that mean something. Median household income in the early 1950s sat somewhere around $3,000 to $3,300 a year. So before we even get into inflation calculators, you can already see the shape of the picture. Everything cost pennies, but people were also earning a tiny fraction of what we earn today. The real question was never whether the numbers on the price tag were small. It's whether those small numbers were easy or hard to come by. If digging into the real, honest numbers behind how people actually lived is something you find genuinely interesting, go ahead and subscribe to Back Home in America, because we do exactly this kind of thing every week. So let's do this properly and adjust everything for inflation, because that's the only fair way to compare 1950 to today. Using the Bureau of Labor Statistics inflation calculator, that 77-cent gallon of milk becomes roughly $10 in today's money. That 53-cent dozen of eggs becomes about $7. The 51-cent pound of hamburger becomes close to $7 as well. Coffee, at 79 cents a pound, comes out to around $10 a pound in today's terms. Now go to an actual grocery store today and look at what you'd pay. A gallon of milk today runs under $4 in most of the country. A dozen eggs, outside of the price spikes we've seen in recent years, typically runs under $3 for a basic dozen. A pound of ground beef is commonly under $7. In other words, when you actually adjust for inflation, milk and eggs in 1950 were considerably more expensive in real terms than they are today. Ground beef comes out close to even. This genuinely surprises people because our instinct is to assume everything just keeps getting more expensive over time. And for a lot of categories, particularly dairy and eggs, that instinct is actually backwards. So why does 1950 still feel, in the popular imagination, like a time when people had less? Here's where the real answer starts to show up. And it's not really about grocery prices at all. It's about what share of a family's income groceries actually consumed. Multiple sources estimate that the average American family in the 1950s spent somewhere around a quarter of their take-home pay on food. A quarter. Today, depending on the study you look at, American households typically spend somewhere between 10 and 12% of their disposable income on food. That's the number that actually tells the real story. It's not that food was absurdly cheap in 1950. It's that food ate up a dramatically bigger slice of a much smaller paycheck. Think about what that actually means for a household budget. If a quarter of every dollar coming into the house is going straight to the grocery store, there's a lot less room left over for everything else. For saving, for unexpected expenses, for the small comforts we take for granted today. A family in 1950 wasn't broke exactly, but they were working with a genuinely tighter, less forgiving budget than most people imagine when they picture the simple, cheap prices from that era. Let's look at the bigger purchases too, because this is where the story gets even more interesting, and honestly a little uncomfortable if you're comparing it to today. That median home value we mentioned, $7,354 in 1950, sounds impossibly cheap. But compare it to that $3,000 median income, and you get a home costing somewhere around 2.5 times a family's annual income. Compare that to today, where median home prices in a huge number of American markets run 6, 7, 8 times median household income, and suddenly 1950 starts looking less like a golden age and more like a genuinely different, and in this specific case, considerably more favorable relationship between what people earned and what a home actually cost. New homes in 1950 were also, on average, under 1,000 square feet, smaller than what most families would consider standard today. And new home buyers were overwhelmingly first-time buyers in their 20s, buying on a single income, since the two-income household hadn't yet become the norm it is today. So a young family in 1950 could genuinely buy a smaller, more modest home on one paycheck at a price that was a much smaller multiple of that paycheck than what young families face buying a home today. That's a real, measurable, honest advantage 1950 had, and I don't think it's fair to just wave that away. We're getting into the part of this story I find genuinely fascinating, and if any of this is surprising you the way it surprised me digging into it, a like on this video helps more people find their way to this kind of honest breakdown. But I want to be fair to the other side of this too, because 1950 also had real, genuine disadvantages that the everything was cheaper nostalgia conveniently skips over. Healthcare cost about $124 per person per year in 1960, and that number is genuinely startling low. But it's low largely because medicine itself could do dramatically less. There was no reliable treatment for a huge range of conditions we manage routinely today. A serious illness in 1950 was far more likely to be a death sentence, not because doctors were careless, but because the actual tools and drugs available were so much more limited. Cheap healthcare in 1950 wasn't really a triumph of affordability. It largely reflected how little medicine could actually offer, for better or worse. Consumer goods generally were also more expensive relative to income than they are today. Appliances, furniture, clothing, a lot of the physical stuff that fills a modern household. Manufacturing efficiency, global trade, and automation have made an enormous range of goods dramatically cheaper in real terms since 1950. Even as some specific categories, like housing and healthcare, have moved sharply the other direction. So the honest picture isn't 1950 was cheap or 1950 was expensive. It's that some things were much cheaper relative to income. Some things were much more expensive. And the mix has shifted around dramatically in both directions over the following 75 years. There's actually a better way to compare eras than either raw prices or inflation-adjusted dollars. And economists use it precisely because it cuts through a lot of the confusion we've been wrestling with. It's called the time cost of an item, meaning how many hours of an average person's labor it actually took to earn enough to buy something. Let's try it. In 1950, average hourly wages for a production worker sat somewhere around $1.50 an hour. That gallon of milk at 77 cents took about half an hour of work to earn. Today, at a rough average wage of $30 an hour, a $4 gallon of milk takes about 8 minutes. By this measure, milk got dramatically cheaper, which lines up with what we already found looking at inflation-adjusted prices. Now try it with that median home. In 1950, at roughly $3,000 a year, buying a $7,300 home meant saving up something like 2.5 years of total income. Though, of course, almost nobody paid cash, they financed it. But the ratio still tells you something real. Try the same math with a median home today against median income. And in a large number of American markets, that ratio has stretched out to 6, 7, sometimes 8 years of income, not 2.5. Same math, same method, and it tells you plainly, cheaper in labor hours for milk, dramatically more expensive in labor hours for a house. This is, I think, the actual right way to ask whether people were richer or poorer, because it strips away the confusion of comparing dollar amounts across two totally different economies and just asks the only question that actually matters to a real person standing in a store. How much of my life did I have to trade for this? I think the real answer to the question in the title, were people actually poorer, is genuinely more interesting than a simple yes or no, and it's worth sitting with for a second. A family in 1950 was, in a very specific and measurable sense, financially tighter on day-to-day essentials, spending a much bigger share of a much smaller income on food. But that same family, for the ones who could buy a home, had access to housing at a price relative to their income that would look almost unbelievable to a young family today. Healthcare was cheap because medicine could do less, not because the system was more generous. And an enormous number of the physical goods that fill a modern life were, relative to income, considerably harder to come by. So the honest answer isn't that 1950 was poorer or richer than today. It's that 1950 ran on a completely different set of trade-offs.
Tighter on groceries, dramatically more favorable on housing, worse on medical outcomes despite lower prices, generally more constrained on consumer goods. Anyone who tells you it was simply better or simply worse is, I think, oversimplifying a genuinely complicated economic picture in order to make a cleaner point. Here's what I keep coming back to about all of this. We tend to reach for grocery prices as a kind of shorthand for how good or bad an era was to live in, because they're simple, memorable numbers you can put right next to today's receipt. 53 cents for eggs feels like proof of something. But a price tag on its own, without the income standing behind it, tells you almost nothing real. The actual question was never how many cents a dozen eggs cost. It was how many hours of an ordinary person's labor it took to earn that dozen eggs, and by extension, everything else in the cart.
I don't think there's a tidy verdict to hand you at the end of this one, and I'm genuinely suspicious of anyone who claims there is. 1950 wasn't the paradise the cheap price tags suggest, and it wasn't the hardship some modern comparisons make it sound like either. It was a specific, particular arrangement of costs and incomes, with real advantages and real disadvantages, and the only honest thing to do with a comparison like that is actually look at all of it, instead of reaching for whichever half of the story fits the point you already wanted to make. If your own family has stories about what the household budget actually looked like back then, what a paycheck really had to stretch to cover, I'd genuinely love to hear it in the comments.
Numbers on a page only tell part of the story, and the specific, lived details are exactly what round it out. If you want more of this kind of honest, numbers-first look at how Americans actually lived, subscribe to Back Home in America. There's a lot more of this country's real history still waiting to be dug into properly. Thanks for spending this time with me. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.